Hello, everybody coming in. It's so good to see you. If you are able to turn your cameras on, we'd love that. If it's not possible, we completely understand as well. Welcome. My name is Andy Engel, and I lead virtual programs here at Reimagine. Reimagine is a nonprofit organization catalyzing a uniquely powerful community. People of different backgrounds, different ages, races, sexual orientations, gender identities, and faiths, people of no faith, all coming together to heal ourselves, our communities, and the world. We support each other in facing adversity, loss, and mortality, and we attempt to transform life's biggest challenges into action and growth. Reimagine resources, support groups, events like this one today are free, sliding scale, and accessible to the public. This is made possible by the support and generosity of participants like you. So for those of you who already made a tax-deductible donation when you registered, thank you. Your gift will immediately support Reimagine's mission to help people of all walks of life transform the hard parts into purpose and meaning. Our theme this month is anticipatory grief. This is the kickoff of a three-part series we're producing called The Long Goodbye. The losses we anticipate can often go unacknowledged, whether it's caregiving for a loved one, managing our own chronic or serious illnesses, our fears about climate change and planetary extinction, or the sorrow we feel as neighbors and neighborhood institutions evolve. These are just few examples. The central questions are, how do we transform all the feels associated with impending loss into a commitment to action? Is it possible to grow and learn from all of the uncertainty and change, both in our personal lives and in the world around us? Today's panel discussion, Let's Learn, is moderated by grief expert, author, and my new colleague, Lisa Keefauver. It's been great working with you as a thought partner, Lisa. Absolutely. Joining the discussion is Kyle Hill, a public health researcher specializing in how Indigenous practices support adaptation to climate change. We've got Jamie Thrower, a death doula and founder of the Queer Grief Club. There's Dr. Quinn Galloway Salazar, an end-of-life doula who elevates the quality of life of military and veteran communities. And we've got Myra Sack, a mother and the author of 57 Fridays, a memoir illustrating the power of ritual to navigate anticipatory grief. You can read their full bios in the event description that my colleague Nicole Tan will paste in the chat. Thank you, Nicole. For the second session of this series, Let's Experience, we've got Jamie Morrison, who is a caregiver and dance educator. She'll be leading a movement workshop for those expecting loss. That's next Wednesday. And finally, the third Wednesday of we've got Let's Take Action with grief expert and author Claire Bidwell Smith. And this just in, we had to change our other guest, but I'm thrilled that Darnell Lamont Walker, who is a death doula, writer, and filmmaker, will be filling in. So please register for that as well. I also want to give a special plug to our community of Reimagine collaborators. These folks host their own events on our platform. Most of what you see on Reimagine's schedule is produced by Reimagine collaborators. And this month, we encourage them to provide offerings related to the theme of anticipatory grief. And if you're interested in hosting your own event on Reimagine's platform, you can do that. And Nicole will paste a link for that in the chat so you can learn about that. And just a few Zoom tips. For those who wish, you can click on the CC icon at the bottom of the screen to get a live transcript of what's being said. And if you'd like You can also save and download the chat by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat box. Feel free to send me or Nicole a note in chat privately. If you're having any difficulties, we'll try to help you out. And please note, we are recording this program, so everyone who has registered, whether you're here tonight or you're watching this later, you'll get this in the follow-up email with a bunch of resources from us, links to all of our speakers. So I am done here. And now, I should tell you first that our conversation with this panel, led by Lisa Keefauver, will be around 40 minutes. We'll take your questions in the chat. And as you listen to these really smart folks, you may have some ideas about questions, so please paste them in there. We'll be fielding those questions during the Q&A portion. And now I'm going to hand this over to Lisa Keefauver, who I first got to know when she spoke at Reimagine's Mother's Day program earlier this year. Lisa, thanks again, and I'm handing this off to you.
Well, thank you, Andy, and Nicole, thank you to Reimagine for inviting this incredible crew of fellow panelists that I have tonight to hold sacred space for these important conversations that I think everyone who's committing their evening to being here understands how important it is that we co-create and create sacred spaces where we can acknowledge this thing that happens to us. 100% of us will experience grief multiple times in our lives. And so I'm so grateful to Reimagine for creating this platform and for allowing me to invite and be a part of this crew. And also just thank you to all of you. I'm seeing some of your faces across the screen. Thankfully, we have so many people, we can't even capture it in one screen, but just know that I see you. And I imagine that I just want to take a note and orient directly to you who are showing up today. Before I invite my panelists to speak, I just want to hold space for a moment and name and acknowledge that if you've signed up for an event on anticipatory grief, then that might likely mean that you're either in the throes of it right now or have passed through that in a recent season of your life. And so just to name and acknowledge, we're gonna hold space for all of us. I'm gonna invite the panelists to tell stories from their own lived experiences, which might sound like yours. They might not sound like yours. But just to remember to have such grace and compassion for yourself. And if, as we progress in this evening, something comes up for you, you might feel maybe overcome by emotion, and just to do what you need to do. Whenever I lead these conversations, I always want to remind us that our first and most important number one job is to take care of ourselves. So if at any time you feel called to turn off your camera or walk away from the computer, right, panelists, we absolutely are encouraging you to do that. And it's an important skill as we navigate grief. So just wanted to orient us there today. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit and ground our conversation today a little bit about what anticipatory grief is and isn't. And then I'm going to invite our panelists to talk about their own perspectives and the wisdom that they've learned from each of their own lived lives, both personally and professionally. I think I can speak for all of us when I say each of us are showing up both personally and professionally, working in the grief and death space and the grieving space. And so you'll see both of those aspects of ourselves come through. As Andy mentioned, my name is Lisa Keefauver. I am a social worker by training. I'm a grief activist. I host a podcast and wrote a book, both of which are called Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. And so I come to this topic, of course, as a social worker, because when you work with humans, that means you work with grief and death. But I also come as a widow. I come as a cancer survivor of late. And so I come also with my personal experiences of navigating loss. But I wanted to orient us, which might seem redundant, because if you're showing up for a talk on anticipatory grief, I have a hunch you have a sense of what it is. But I wanted to orient and remind us that anticipatory grief is just one of many forms of grief that we experience. throughout the expanse of our lives. It might be one of the many forms we experience over one particular loss. As the title of this series is The Long Goodbye, typically an anticipatory grief happens as a result of perhaps a terminal diagnosis of someone you love. And I want to remind us we can anticipate our own death. And so that can also be true if we've been diagnosed with a terminal. But it can also happen with other life-limiting or chronic illnesses that are degenerative. If someone is off to war, and I think Quinn will help us understand that, the experiences around veterans, or even having disappeared in our lives due to addiction. Anticipatory grief can come when we expect an ending to be happening far off in the future. We're going to explore what the term means, how useful it is and not. And I know Myra's going to speak to that in a little bit, but I wanted to also remind all of us as we come here today that maybe bust a couple of myths about anticipatory grief or offer some reminders that I think might be helpful to orient our conversation. And that is, anticipatory grief is not pre-grieving the death or the grief that you're going to experience after someone dies. It's about beginning to grieve all of the losses. That might be losses of ability or freedom or mobility or capacity. That's beginning to lose the loss of dreams and future, right? Maybe loss of financial stability, depending on the situation. So when we think about the anticipatory grief we experience, the invitation then is we don't need to wait. And the reason it's important to recognize that we are experiencing losses that are falling on top of each other prior to somebody's death is to give ourselves permission to grieve those losses, which is a counter narrative that many of us, and I think are my panelists, Jamie, Myra, Kyle, even Quinn might bring up this evening. We often feel a lot of internalized or externalized pressure that to grieve before someone dies means we're giving up. And I wonder how many people in this room today have had that thought for themselves or for somebody else. And I want to just ground us and remind us that we can fight like hell, we can hope, and we can be tenacious in our efforts to create a long or at least a quality of life for the person that we love or for ourselves. And we can also acknowledge and name and begin to grieve the losses that are happening as we move towards maybe that inevitable end. So I just wanted to ground us in that. I think for many people, as I've worked with people one-on-one over the years and with my guests, many of us hold a lot of guilt or shame or regret around allowing ourselves this place. So I'm going to pause there. There's some other reminders I'm going to sprinkle in the evening, and I'm going to invite my guests to sort of speak to that, but just to name that we can give ourselves permission to begin grieving prior to the loss, and that it's a very normal response to that place. But I want to first begin by inviting Myra Sack to join into the conversation. Myra, spending a little time orienting us to your own personal experience of attending to anticipatory grief. And I know we've talked in the past too about, in particular, where that term can be helpful or not from your own experience. And I also think when I think about your story, having gotten to know you, having interviewed you on my show so long ago, read your beautiful memoir, and now get to call you among my very special friends, is that for you, you used your time in advance of that death to create ritual. And so I would love to make sure that as you tell your story, you invite us to understand the power of ritual when we have a chance to know we have some time, when we have a long goodbye. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Andy. I come here first as a bereaved mom. My story and the reason why I'm speaking in the anticipatory grief space tonight is that my first daughter, Javi, was diagnosed with a fatal neurodegenerative disease and told she had 12 to 18 months to live when she was 15 months old. So I was a first-time mother when we got this diagnosis, a diagnosis that we had thought could never be because we had undergone all of the preventative genetic testing before Javi was even an idea. Unfortunately, a fatal physician ordering error had been made. And so Javi's life and death was rather dramatic. And Tay-Sachs disease, by definition, is a neurodegenerative disease that basically strips you of everything: the capacity to eat, to drink, to talk, to move, to hear, to see. And so at 15 months, we were facing this reality that our daughter was going to lose everything and going to die within a year or so. And the question became, what do you do? How do you live? How do you exist? How do we exist? And I think in that moment, it was really this apocalyptic moment. Apocalyptic comes from the Greek root to lay bare or expose. And so everything about me was exposed. And maybe in that space, I was able to actually operate from a place of courage and conviction like that I had never before. And I was actually driven by this yearning and craving for more of her, for more time, for as much fullness as we could get. And it was in that moment that this concept, this ritual that we created, where we combined Friday evenings with Shabbat, we celebrated Shabbat. And if we combine those two, and Javi's birthday, this notion of, I couldn't wrap my head or heart around the fact that my daughter was going to have only 2 birthdays on this earth. So if we combine those two, a Friday with a birthday or a Shabbat with a birthday, and called it Shabirthdays, could we see how many of these Shabirthdays we could get with her on this earth? And could I live from one Shabirthday to the next, as opposed to try to imagine a future without her, as opposed to being paralyzed in fear? Could I turn towards, lean into the beauty and the pain, the sort of both and ultimately we got 57 of these. That's the title of the book, 57 Fridays. And those evenings were filled with excruciating pain and big love, and always blueberries, because that was her favorite food. And when she lost the ability to chew, blueberries became blueberry smoothies. And still that ritual of making blueberry smoothies and hearing that blender, and seeing that vibrant blue purple, and always wearing purple because that was her color. Those are some of the ways that still ritual enables us to integrate her rather than run the risk of disintegrating. The prefix means to cut off or exclude. And so I think when Lisa and I had first talked about this, the question of how useful is anticipatory grief, I think anything that validates and honors grief is good. And there is so much that doesn't. I think the challenge with it, in my mind, when misunderstood, might sort of create this sense that we are waiting for the other shoe to drop. That we sort of focus too much on anticipation, when I think in my mind it's the ultimate test of presence. That's life. It's the ultimate test of Malka Tussman's poem, "Today is forever, forever is right now," and how we embrace the notion of today is forever, as we are, yes, grieving and loving. And so that's, I'll stop there because we have beautiful panelists who,
No, thank you. Thank you. And I just you were talking, so I don't know if you could see, but so many people were nodding their head and hands on their heart and just really leaning into your story. And I just want to bring Javi into the room with us today. And there's some things that you said there that, again, I saw some folks nodding, and I'm going to lead into, as I ask other people questions, I think in particular Quinn next, because I know she's spoken a lot about living even while you're dying, and having that be a theme of what her work is. But I want to amplify back to the room, to a few hundred of us that are in here, to remind us that word that you said, apocalyptic. And we all know that moment when we get that news, that apocalyptic moment. And to think about it as being laid bare is so powerful, because it's an invitation to then say, now what? How do I want to spend this time? what matters to me most. And I don't mean to sound poetic, because it's also a moment where we are curled up in a fetal position and howling at the moon and, raging against the world. So it's not all poetic sunshine. And I think it was so powerful of you to invite us to think, um, how might we use this to understand that we've been laid bare, and how might we spend our precious time? Some of us, we have a sense of how long that is. Some of us, it could be, years. For some of us, it might be weeks or days or even hours. And so thank you for reminding us that the way in which we can do that, and to reorient us all, which I think helps us in anticipatory grief and in life, that the only place we have is this moment, and then this moment, and then this moment. And unfortunately, it takes some of these apocalyptic shifts to remind us of that important truth. And so thank you so much for sharing the way you lived so richly and fully, and gave our folks who are joining us today some ideas about how they might include ritual to be really grasping at all the life that you want to take in. Quinn, I saw you nodding a lot when we were talking with Myra, so I wanted to go to you next, because I know when we've talked in the past, I want you to first orient your story professionally, personally, how you come to think about this topic. But I know in your work, I believe in your work, you've talked before about this very notion of how do we live, and what does that look like, and the courage it takes and the practices it takes to live, even in the face of an end in sight. So just welcoming you into the room and how you want to share. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having us, all of us in this space, having this difficult but yet needed conversation.
Yeah.
I came to the death space from suicide prevention. And if we really think even deeper, suicide prevention can be tethered to anticipatory grief, especially for our military connected communities. But I had a mentor along this journey that was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer from the burn pits in the Middle East. Of a lifetime that I had with her to the end of, right? We met monthly and we had conversations, not just about her illness, but how she was living through her illness. And it was in those moments where I realized that it's important for us to acknowledge the grief, acknowledge the what's to come, but also be present to the present. And so I often talk about, even though we may know that our person is dying, we've got to also embrace that they are still living while they're dying. So what are those things that we can do in those moments? How can we collect their stories?
Yeah.
How can we ensure that their legacies live on, right? One of the things that my mentor, and I'll call her by her name was Kate. Kate used to say, wear that red lipstick. Now, when you see me wear red lipstick, and when Kate says wear that red lipstick, when she would say, it was a nod to the fact that in World War II, women who wore red lipstick, it was a thing for soldiers, for women to wear that red lipstick, right? So there's a historical context to that. And so I do that whenever I show up on a stage or I show up to a meeting, it's a nod to wear that red lipstick. Because even though she was facing some of the most challenging moments of her existence, she still found joy. She still found hope in living. And so I can't stress enough, be actively present.
Yeah.
Right? Ask that person, what's your favorite song? What's blueberries? Is it blueberries is your favorite fruit? Let's incorporate some of the things that are unique about you that we can continue to embrace and continue to celebrate when you are no longer physically present.
Yeah.
And that was tremendous for me as I walked through the end with her, right?
Yeah.
A month before she passed away, I did her oral history because she had a 7-year-old son. And excuse me you all for saying this, but I'm in the military and sometimes we use swear words. But I wanted her son to know how badass his Marine mom was.
Yeah.
And so it was so important to capture her legacy, her life in her words as a testament that she lived.
Yeah. So beautiful, Quinn. Thank you. And thank you for bringing Kate into the room. And I think we can all hold Kate too. And as a reminder to all of us, again, we don't know what kind of time we have. And there might be people on this call who maybe your person has already lost their ability to speak. So collecting a story might not be available to you, but maybe you can bring found objects and see what lights them up if their eyes are still open and how they light up, or to offer them the different scents, or if they can still eat, solid foods, what might be the foods that they love that you can get the recipe cards out for, right? Sometimes we're going to have to be creative. We don't always have this long entry, or they're so young they can't communicate, as in Javi's case, in that way, but to be creative and to capture those stories and to capture those memories. Ask the questions. Anticipatory grief is an invitation that is something that, by the way, we can do in life in general, not just in loss, which is ask the questions, say the things, share how you feel, right? Jamie, I want to talk with you a little bit. I want to invite you into the room about the other kinds of experiences besides a death or terminal diagnosis that might find us in that way. And also, of course, the ways in which our social location in the world, whether we have a queer identity or another identity, can impact the resources of the way we can access. I want to ground that. I want to first just remind the room, or offer to the room, that many of the experiences that we have in anticipatory grief are the same, that are going to look the same as the grief we have when someone dies. We're going to feel sorrow and anger and despair and longing and homesickness, right? And anxiety, but there are some unique things that we might want to pay attention to. There is going to be maybe a level of exhaustion if we're a caretaker. That's the different kind of exhaustion than we might experience in the wake of loss. But we're also probably going to have a heightened anxiety because we're going to be hyper alert to the signs and signals that our people are maybe coming towards the end of our lives. And so, or watching somebody suffer. So I just want us to remember, in case it doesn't get brought up in the community, that to attend to ourselves, to attend to that hyper alertness, to attend to the care and nurturing of our bodies and our minds is so important, both for ourselves, but also so that we can do what Quinn and Myra has invited us to do, which is show up and be present. And it's just so hard to do that when we are strung, wrought out from that hyper alertness and that hypervigilance. So Jamie, I want to welcome you into the room and to share a little bit about your story. And I think in particular, thinking about the kind of anticipatory grief we might experience outside of maybe what we've been talking about today so far.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Anticipatory grief is one of those things that when I finally heard the term as someone who was a griever, it made so much sense to me, because I couldn't understand why I was going through this gamut of emotions before, like, each one of my parents had died. And kind of to speak to what we've been like thinking about and kind of discussing of, like, does this term help us? Do we, like, how does it help? What purpose does it serve? And to me, it was really enlightening, and it was really empowering, because it gave a name to something that I didn't know what it was. But then at the same time, it also kind of, I had the notion that, like, okay, I'm grieving this death that's going to happen, and when I'm getting ahead of the curve by grieving, like, I'm doing the extra credit homework right now because I'm grieving before the death, so it's going to make it easier. And what I, as we all come to find that grief is such a complex, state of emotions and of experiences. And so it was so profoundly different um, once my parents died. But I've found that, now in my 30s, I have experienced anticipatory grief in a really new and different way, and that has a lot to do with identity. And
Mhm.
my partner and I went through a really challenging and heartbreaking fertility experience. We lost a baby and then had multiple miscarriages after that. And as we were going through IVF and we were doing all these things, there was so much anticipatory grief for, what if I never get to become a mother? What if I never get to have this queer family that I've always dreamed of? And so there was, as I started talking to more people about what does it mean to have anticipatory grief over an experience or over an identity, and hearing from other people within my community talking about like anticipatory grief of coming out, of like worrying about what it's going to be like when we come out to family members, to community, to people that we love. Are we going to lose people because of that? Are we already losing people? Like what? And so like being able to think and hold, in the same way that we're talking about, like, how are we using this time or this anticipatory grief to be present to what is, but like also for me, it's how can we also acknowledge the grief? Because there sometimes is almost more pressure of like, just stay present in the moment and, be here and try not to let the grief overtake you. But there's also a like, what if we allow the grief to be here? What if we invite the grief in and let it be part of our story and know that it's not, it is that it allows us to embrace life in a different way. And it allows us to reshift our priorities, to think about all the different ways in which grief touches our lives. And so it's been a really interesting thing to just see how we use anticipatory grief, or how we just use grief in general, how it connects us to other people, how we create more space for it in our lives, how we give ourselves more permission to just deeply feel what we are experiencing in that moment, and to be able to hold all of the nuances and the complexities of that, knowing that it's all of that is okay. And so that's been yeah, it's been a really beautiful conversation that I've had with a lot of people. And to think about like, especially within my queer community, like how can we hold more space for the anticipatory grief of something like a coming out story, or of needing to, receive care at the end of our life and worrying about what that experience might look like because of our identity. So, just acknowledging, making more space for the grief that's there, and naming that can be a really powerful thing, in just helping people feel witnessed in that experience.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie, so much. You touched on a couple of themes I was hoping we would cover tonight, and I can imagine that folks in the room are experiencing in those. And one of that I wanted to name was just when we have something ongoing that might result in a series of losses or potential losses, which is different than following one person's illness to the end. And it's so, um, just such a rich remembering that we can do the both and. Myra and I both love the both and conversation. I have literally and tattooed on my body, which is to be present and grieve, to be with the grief, and to not have a moral judgment or a value judgment on having it, and to allow ourselves with self-compassion to navigate back and forth between being present and maybe celebratory and collecting stories, while also then allowing, the grief to be present, to move through us. Remember, grief is, emotional, cognitive, physical, relational, spiritual. It's not just about feeling sad. And so we have to find space for it. And also for you to help us think about the potential losses that a coming out story rightly and necessarily might cause somebody to feel some anticipatory grief or some concern, and to not, sort of gaslight yourself to that you are anticipating that, and to acknowledge that that is we don't know what's going to happen, but it is potentially there. And so to allow ourselves to be with that, I think is important for all of us in the room. I'm wanting to make sure that we have some time to spend with Kyle, because I know, Kyle, you're bringing such a unique perspective in your work, your PhD. I want to hear your story, but thinking about how do we navigate different kinds of losses that are both current and future losses? And when I think about the land, you've talked before about the non-human relatives that we lose with migration, way of life. This is another way, as alluding to what Jamie talked about, where we're having current losses while future losses are unfolding and we don't know what that looks like. So how are we grieving what is and anticipating that future loss? But want to welcome you in, and how do you want to orient yourself to this conversation and to this, help us see a new perspective too on anticipatory grief?
Yeah, well, bonjour everyone, means hello in Ojibwe. Really just grateful to be here, listening to Myra's story. I have a 2-year-old, and so I think just grounding myself in that, like as a father, as a, once was a child myself. And I think, for me, coming into this discussion, a couple things kind of resonated for me relative to grief and anticipatory grief. And of course, much of my work revolves around the impacts of climate change to our mental health, and particularly Indigenous people's health and wellness. As an Indigenous person myself, I'm an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe, and a lineal descendant to the Siston, Wapton, and Cheyenne River Sioux tribes in South Dakota. I think on one hand, Indigenous folks, and I'll speak for, American Indian folks like myself, we grapple with a tremendous amount of loss historically, from colonialism. And from boarding schools, losing relatives that way, to forced sterilizations of, our grandparents, the 2 or 3 generations above us, the loss of languages. Our languages are, many are endangered at this time. And of course, the dispossession and removal from our traditional homelands, so just acknowledging that, all of us, if we're in the States, we sit on Indigenous territories and homelands. And so we're visitors here. And yet, for our communities, we have a strong relationship to our homelands, a lot of sacred places where there have been burials. And one thing that's powerful for me is reclaiming some of those historical and traditional and spiritual ways. And one thing that we had the opportunity to do only through recent learning was we did a placental burial for my daughter at what is understood as the genesis of Dakota people, or my own tribe here in Hepadote, which is a small island at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. But I think that's really profound, because historically that was a place where Dakota women traveled many miles to give birth. And so there was a history of like midwives there. Indigenous midwifery practices were commonplace. Medicines were on this island. But now, the island, through displacement and forced removals, is a state park. And you would never know what traditions exist there, the history of that place. So it was really profound for us to do that. And now I think as we grapple with or reconcile the environmental changes that are happening in front of our eyes, particularly for coastal communities that are forced to migrate, right? So the climate migration is really just at this point, getting to be so, I think, commonplace. I mean, we think of Florida, right? I mean, that's an easy kind of place to think about folks that are migrating right now because of climate change, or seriously thinking about it.
Yeah.
You know, so I think as we anticipate changes, you know, for folks like me, we also have to grapple with the changes that occurred for through the removals, through the acts of violence, through genocide. And we have to ask ourselves, well, we continue to grieve the loss of all of these, you know, of our ancestors, of our languages, of all these things, but yet we're still a people of these lands and territories. Now, how do we deal with, and how do we come, you know, to the front lines to be able to do everything that we can to take care of our lands? Because we have been for time immemorial the caretakers of these lands and the stewards of what we know as Turtle Island, which is North America. And so that's really complicated, as you can imagine, because, you know, I think trauma and historical trauma is one thing, you know, it's felt very deeply, and yet it's not there, right? You have no experience with it. So, you know, one memory I have when I was in grad school, and I went to school for clinical psychology, and I was a licensed psychologist for some time. But I remember in graduate school, we were asked, you know, tell us about some things, impactful experiences in your life, or who you are and where you're at now. And there was only myself and one other student in a class of maybe 20 to 25 people that had talked about experiences before our life started, you know, our ancestral kind of ties. And it was a Jewish student and myself. Both of us had been through a Holocaust of, you know, for lack of a better word, or genocide for our peoples. And so I think, you know, like I said, going through life with these experiences and folks in the audience will know, I think there's a bit of a different tinge to life, right? And we have to look through those glasses and appreciate them for what they are, you know. And at the same time, we try to do our best to learn, to decolonize, if you will, to reclaim our traditional ways, our languages, and also revitalize that connection to our traditional homelands, you know. And I think it's an everyday kind of task and chore, because sometimes it is a chore, you know, like it'd be simple to just not do any of it. But I think your heart and your spirit calls for it, you know, and needs that, whether it's culture, traditional spirituality, the ceremonies. And I think for this talk in particular, for our panel, one of the questions in the audience was like, you know, I'm dealing with an illness for my mom. Like, what are some helpful, you know, some helpful coping mechanisms? And one for me was spirituality and ceremony, you know, and that is ancestral. Like, there's no other way to put it. But that was so helpful. And so all that is to say, I think we all know, many of us know the term, you know, complex grief or complicated grief, you know, and the way I understand that is when you experience grief at a pace where it's hard to reconcile or resolve one grief before you move on to the other. And it gets to the point where they're all just jumbled up and, you know, you don't know which one ends before the other one begins, and the waves just crash into each other, you know. And that's often how it feels. But, you know, I think together, I think this is powerful, just being together and talking about grief in all the different shapes and forms, and just appreciate it. But I'll leave us with that.
Yeah. Thank you,
Mhm.
Kyle, so much
Mhm.
for helping us understand
Mhm.
different contexts and the way grief
Mhm.
overlaps and the way we carry our grief through generations. And, you brought in an audience question, and I know Andy is probably going to bring us some questions
Mhm.
from the audience soon, but I wanted to tie together something you said. I hope I heard this right, is to think about, one of the things that I hear you doing in your work is how are we, even as we anticipate future losses or concern that we're going to have future losses, how do we reach back in time and bring the stories back to what Quinn
Mhm.
said, bring the practices, bring the rituals, maybe bring our spirituality. And so
Mhm.
in those ways, it's not that the losses aren't coming, but there's less, we're able to carry some of the pieces of our past, of our land, of our traditions, of our
Mhm.
people, individual people,
Mhm.
collective people with us. And to
Mhm.
the audience member, to think about part of what I hope we'll talk about as we take questions, is to think about how do we walk this, like what are some of the tools that we use as we
Mhm.
walk this space, whatever we're in anticipatory grief. And you named one of the first ones I was going to offer to the room, which is to not walk alone, to be in community with other
Mhm.
people who are
Mhm.
navigating. It could be the exact same kind of loss. So maybe you're looking for an online group of people who are caring for their mothers too, or it just could be in rooms like this. It could be with friends who've been there and done that. Grief, regardless of the form, anticipatory, complex, any kind of grief that we experience, we are not meant to grieve alone. We humans are social creatures. And so that might look differently for you. It might not be an online support group. It might not be a Reimagine event, although they're here every month and they're quite powerful community gatherings. They might look like some of the things Myra Sachs' organization does, which is community and movement and ritual at Emotion. It can look like a lot of things, but I think I want to turn to Andy by saying one of the most powerful reminders for all of us, myself included, and I do this for a living, and I still have to remind myself when I'm in spaces of my own anticipatory grief, is to set down the, pull yourself up by your bootstraps idea that we have in this country and to seek community. Is being in community going to make the pain disappear? No. But what we get by being in community is to feel seen and held, and for someone to help us carry the weight for just a little while. Yeah.
Mhm.
Andy, I want to make sure, because I saw that chats were popping up, but I was really trying to attend to the speakers, so I did not see the actual questions because I'm a little too distractible to be able to see that. But I wonder if there are particular questions or folks you wanted to invite in.
Sure. So,
And
continue,
yay, I get to see more faces now. Hello, everybody.
continuing, with, responses of support to, Colleen's question about coping strategies. We had talked about spirituality. I just want to acknowledge and thank everyone who is in attendance here for offering their suggestions too. Greta suggested getting some extra sleep for support. Um, um, Kyle, you mentioned being with your dog, animal support is great. We also got some suggestions for being in nature and a hot bath. I want to go to Jackie's, but before I do that, I just want to offer something else, creativity. I'm just thinking about that
yeah.
as a modality, I'm thinking about Myra and movement. Both Dr. Quinn and JV struck me as creative people.
Yeah.
Both Myra and Lisa Wright. Kyle, we didn't talk about this in your bio, but I know you are a grass dancer also. So
Mhm.
I think that's worth some discussion before we move on to the next question.
Yeah. I want to just add creativity among the other things that I think are so
Mhm.
important in our resourcing ourselves. And that's how I think about it. How can we resource ourselves is to remember that when we are in this place, we are generally in a kind of hypervigilant or active state, or what many of us might think of as fight or flight. And creativity, whether that's a 3-minute dance party in your house or writing poetry or consuming poetry or painting or grass dance or whatever, is actually a way in which we can resource our bodies by regulating our nervous system. So you don't have to be an artist. You don't have to be a, professional writer for creativity in whatever form it comes in your life to help resource your nervous system, right? To get into more regulation. Quinn, I saw you nodding a lot. I wonder if you wanted to contribute there or.
Yeah, I'd love to. Art is my thing.
Yeah.
Right? I can't always get outside the way that I want to, but on the other side of this space is my art space. And it allows me to take a moment, right, to be still.
Yeah.
And what's so important about self-care, whether it's through art, whether it's through meditation, whether it's through whatever modality you choose, it's being intentional with doing it. It's so easy for us to say to other people, make sure you practice self-care.
Right.
But when you're caring for someone or when the world just feels heavy, it's hard.
Yeah.
So maybe that means 2 minutes, just getting your paints together, or 2 minutes to just stand outside and feel the sun, or 2 minutes to stand outside and feel the rain.
Yeah.
You choose to feel something, right? But
Yeah.
art is the thing for me. I could have the hardest day. I'm going to carve out 15 minutes for art every day of my life.
Thank you. I think it comes back to what we've talked about before, which is to be creative means you're present. And again, it can take 2 minutes or 1 minute, but it's to be present. Yeah.
I was just going to add 2 really quick thoughts on coping to build on Quinn's points. One is that word intention. And I'm sort of a linguist, and the root of intention is tendere, to stretch. And when we do something physical, we always think about stretching as a good idea beforehand. And the same is true in emotional work. And when we set that intention, then we stretch our capacities to hold more beauty, more pain. And then the second thing I was thinking on coping is this notion of self-awareness. And there's work by Dr. Lisa Feldman-Barrett on emotional granularity that's all about sort of learning to be as specific as we can about how we feel so that we can develop the self-trust to actually then be in community, to be in community with people who might say or do the wrong things despite their best intention. And that self-trust can sort of be like psychological Teflon that we dress ourselves in, when we go out into the world. So those were just 2 thoughts on coping to
Beautiful.
Mhm.
Andy, I didn't want us to spend the rest on creativity, although I don't want to cut people off if there were other questions that were important. Again, I can't see them flying, so I don't know.
I want to go to
check.
Jackie's question.
Okay.
I'll read what she wrote in the chat. My father is dying. He is also an abuser. Despite several attempts to talk with him about his behavior and its impact on me, I will not get the resolution, accountability, healing conversations before his death. He's in a bad place, in pain, frustrated, and resigned. How might I still support his transition while keeping myself safe from his abuse, while grieving the healing, forgiveness that I envisioned, and still be present for the time he has left?
First of all, it's Jackie. Is that what you said? I can't see. Jackie, thank you for trusting us with that question. I just want to name and bringing that into the room. I want to turn to some of my wise colleagues. I'm thinking Jamie in particular, but all of you. And I think what I want to say to you, which I would say to everybody I've ever worked with and myself, is the first place is there's no one right answer. And so to give yourself so much wide, expansive grace and self-compassion that you've never been here before. Nobody's ever navigated this particular loss and the complexity of your loss that you are anticipating, the loss of resolution, the loss of accountability, plus the loss of this human. And so whatever answers we as a collective might offer you, I want you to tuck this away somehow in your heart later on, that you're going to do the best you can to find the path that makes the most sense for you, and that there is no one right path, and to hold deeply to that you are going to, you know, connect with your deepest integrity and do the best you can to find your way, whatever that looks like. I hope you really hear me and hold to that. But Jamie, I saw you nodding when the question was being reading. I don't mean to call you out, and if others want to
No,
add, but
yeah.
yeah.
No, I mean, first of all, what you just said is so beautiful, and really what, you know, I work with a lot of people who either are trying to find a way to show up for parents that they were estranged from, or abuser parents, you know, similar like this. And it's like one of the most difficult questions of how do I show up in this moment while also like holding the space and the care that I need for myself. Like, how do I keep myself safe in this moment too? And so a lot of that is starting to figure out like what, you know, what is your capacity in, you know, in what are the boundaries that you need to put in this space. And then knowing that, like, yes, of course there's going to be a grief process of you know, grieving that healing or the reconciliation or these conversations and the things that you wanted to have with your dad, and also knowing that, you know, that can still happen within yourself. Like, there are still ways that you can you know, that you can have these conversations once he's gone, that you can develop a different kind of relationship. You can decide to forgive or to not forgive, that like you get to really kind of drive your own grief story. And so like what does that mean for you in showing up in this moment? Like, how do you what is the kind of care that you feel like you can offer to this person in this moment, knowing that they only have a certain amount of time left? And then also, like, how are you going to care for yourself through this too? And like, how do you resource yourself to make sure that you're feeling really seen and witnessed in this really complex place that you're in? And that you're also like feeling really cared for, that you're giving yourself the love, the care, the attention that you deserved and you didn't get from your dad. And so it's, you know, it's such a personal question. It's going to be something that you figure out for yourself, you know, and that's going to slowly start to make its ways a little more clear as you take things day by day. But just like sending a lot of extra care and love to you, because it is such a difficult place to navigate, and there are no roadmaps for this.
Yeah,
And that's like
yeah.
probably the most infuriating and exhausting part of all of this, right? Like,
Yeah.
there is no roadmap for this, and it becomes such a personal dance of, you know, of being present and honoring yourself and protecting your peace, and also showing up in ways that feel accessible to you.
Yeah. I wanted to name Jackie, and I think all of us might experience this to some degree, even if maybe we wouldn't identify the person who's passing as an abuser. But for many of us, we lose somebody that we have a complicated relationship with. And we know in this culture that we have this adage of like, don't speak ill of the dead. And that, you know, when someone is sick or when someone has died, that we have to put them up on a pedestal. And that really kind of ties our hands in a knot about being able to actually express and metabolize the complexity of our love, the complexity of our anger, the complexity of our relationship. And so as a reminder to you and anybody who might be anticipating the loss of somebody they have a complicated relationship with, it's okay to give yourself permission to be relieved, be sad, be actually grieving what didn't happen instead of what did, and that you don't have to be participating in the sort of pedestal building that you might feel pressure from other people because you might have a very different relationship, Jackie. And a lot of people who've been abused do, where somebody else in their world didn't have that relationship and they're forcing you to sort of pedestalize, that's not a word, I just made it up, but anyhow, to put that person on a pedestal. And so to give yourself some permission that you don't have to participate in that, I think could be really important. Yeah. Others, Kyle or Quinn on this, or Andy, if there are other questions, again, I can't I see a lot,
Yeah,
there's a lot in the chat, but
I just wanted to, just a couple thoughts on that. First, oh, that's my daughter. I just wanted to mention something that has kind of helped me, I think, just conceptualize loss. And this also comes from, just kind of ancestral teachings of thinking about life as kind of an arc, like we move from like east to west during our life, and we all have a journey. Some might be longer, shorter than others, but once we cross that like west gate, we go to a spirit realm, where all of our ancestors are. And so I think as I've aged, as I've gotten closer to that proverbial end, or made my way across this journey, it's like in some ways I kind of look forward to that, and it's not to say that that I stay there, but I have good feelings about seeing my grandmother again, because she was so important to me. And so I just thought, just a little teaching for folks who are struggling with that, particularly, when we have to grapple with someone who has a history of abuse towards us. They're imperfect, who've been hurt by other people. That maybe the stories will be more beautiful on the other side together, less painful. And then I think secondly, as someone who also deals with, my mother has had issues with substance use for a really long time and addiction. And I feel that very same kind of similar way is like you have to navigate boundaries and also the desire of love, like the desire of a relationship that may never be,
yeah.
So I think Lisa kind of hit it right on the head. It's like, as imperfect as love is, as imperfect as our relationships are, so is grief. It's imperfect. And I think just sitting with that and acknowledging that is really important. Like I don't know of a grief that's, I guess it's imperfect and perfect at the same time, but the way it looks to ourselves, the way it looks to other people, the way we perceive it, may not be what we had intended. But yeah, I mean, it's hard. Relationships are hard. Grief is hard. But
Yeah.
one thing I take from grief most importantly is it shows how much we love,
Yeah.
um
We love life. And sometimes it's not even the love of the person, but it's our need for love and our connection for love. Because I want to name that in particular to Jackie's case, where it can be complicated, our notion of love. But I think grief is really about the longing that we have to love and be loved and to be in community. And to add on to what Kyle said is grief like life, by the way, everybody, even though we're told a story that life is neat, grief is messy and life is messy. And so to Jackie and to all of us, I think one of the biggest barriers that get in our way from just moving through the messiness that is grief is that we hold on to the notion that there's some right way or there's some clean way or there's some way to escape it. And so then we judge ourselves, or I say should all over ourselves, about the way we are navigating our grief. And so just as an invitation to all of us, whether it's a loving relationship that you're anticipating losing or a more complex relationship, is to give yourself permission to be with the complexity of your emotions and the complexity and the messiness of the experience. Yeah. Thank you for
There's
the, yeah.
There's a question from Greta. I'd love to hear more about folks' ideas for creating ritual. We had heard about Myra's birthdays for Javi, especially for those with dementia who are limited in their ability to participate or to remember.
Yeah. I'm noticing I'm talking a lot, so I'm just pausing. Myra, do you have other ideas that you've used as part of your work
Yeah,
now or with
yeah.
other folks? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one quick thing is just thinking about like sensorial, different sensorial ways to access memories when they're not here. So, like lotion, like, you know, even just sort of picking the same lotion to use, and then being able to smell that again and again. I just did that with calendula, a song, music, listening to music together. Yeah, bring their favorite music. I think anything that has a rhythmic, that same patterned, repetitive rhythmic activity that movement has, can be, you know, can be a ritual.
Yeah. I think we saw a lot, did see in the chat a lot of music coming back, and I think we know that from dementia research that music can call people back to places that are deeper in them. And I think I would just add, when we're thinking about the rituals that we can do, particularly with somebody who has limited cognition or maybe limited mobility, is what activity, simple, and it doesn't have to be, when you say ritual, it doesn't have to be the exact same every time, also to give yourself permission to change as the person's ability or cognition changes. But what can allow you to attend to the senses, as Myra said, but also what allows you to connect with the person. So thinking about ways in which, again, it could be touch with the lotion, it could be song, it could be sharing, it could be puzzling, it could be a lot of things, but thinking about that connection, and also what are the seeds that you're planting, because so much of ritual in anticipatory grief also is, as Myra says, still to this day, showing up today in beautiful purple, are maybe the things that are going to allow us to carry our person after their death, and that those rituals will be able to help soothe us as we grieve that person in the wake of loss. So thinking about things that you can carry with you through their life and then afterwards, I think could be really, really powerful. I love music. I love the idea of lotion, sharing a new piece of story. Quinn, I'd love to hear from you and what ritual ideas you have.
Yeah, I saw something recently. Someone posted, and I don't know, it was an elderly gentleman and his granddaughter, and the granddaughter painted his arms and his hands, right? And she painted her arms and her hands, and they had these sweatshirts on,
Oh, yeah.
and they hugged, right? And just the thought of that, right? Thinking about, and I thought about it, and I'm like, I think that's going to be a cool activity for my kids to do with my parents, because my parents are aging. How cool would it be to have that hold, right? When you're having a moment, you're missing your person, and you take that sweatshirt and you put it on and just envelope yourself with that hug, with their arm prints and their handprints around you. What a great way to create a ritual, but also what a great way to memorialize them and to have them close when they're not physically close anymore.
I love that so much. I love that so much. Thank you so much for sharing that as well. You're getting a lot of hearts there. Andy, I'm recognizing we're getting close on time, but wanted to see if there was any closing thoughts or a final question you're hoping for us to bring to the group before we end our
Maybe
evening.
quickly, I think Greta had an interesting question in the chat, because there is a lot of discussion about the 5 stages of grief. A lot of us agree that these are not stages that we go through in a linear way, but
Yeah.
I thought her question was interesting. Like, if you could add additional stages or domains of grief, what would they be?
Well, I think when we think, yes, I want to reiterate 5 stages of grief was how people come to terms with their own death. It wasn't meant to be about how we move in a linear fashion. So yes, we do experience denial and anger and acceptance, but it comes circularly and in waves and over time. David Kessler, who's done work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, of course, just came out with his work about finding meaning, being in another domain that we want to think about. I want to caveat that, which is it's not finding meaning in the death. This is not about it happened for a reason or any other nonsense that people say. When we think about meaning, it's about how do we, as we live, the ones who are left behind, how do we find meaning in life. We can do that by carrying them forward, by creating memorials or bringing their memory with us, but it's really about finding meaning in life. I think that would be the additional thing to think about. Quinn or Myra, Kyle, Jamie, just want to make sure you have time to add.
Myra had a great one in the chat. She wrote surrender.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would add resistance. I feel like there's like a part of the grief experience where you're just like, no, no, no,
Yeah.
no, no, no. I don't want this to be happening. I don't want to deal with any of this. And that is an interesting place to be. And I've noticed like in some of the questions in the chat and a lot of this overwhelming idea of like how can we make this not so heavy, or like what do we do
Yeah.
to kind of alleviate these moments. And I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions of grief, is that we can just like kind of make it better. And for so many of us, like what we really need is to acknowledge just the suck of it all, and how hard and profound, and just it will bring you to your knees. And also, there can be a lot of alchemy in it, but sometimes it's okay to just, like sit with the enormity of it.
Yeah.
And to know that like we can't fix this and we can't make this better. And we can tell ourselves like, it makes so much sense that you're feeling this way, and giving ourselves that permission to really like kind of fall apart is also really powerful, because I think we spend so much time in resistance to grief, or trying to get to a place where it doesn't feel so bad, and we kind of bypass a lot of the bigger experience of like, this can devastate you, it rightfully so. And then grief also allows us to take action in ways that we wouldn't normally, without having the knowledge of this devastation, or like how hard this is. Like we also then get to experience joy in this new way, and we get to experience all these other things in this new way. And so just, giving more permission to ourselves to let ourselves feel that, is freeing too.
Sitting in the suck. I had a podcast guest once say that we need to give ourselves permission to sit in the suck. And I can't be me if I didn't throw in, as we end our time together today, to both and our way, to bookend our conversation with the both and, is to actually sit in the suck, as it were, to be with the heart of grief, is what allows us to be in delight and to appreciate the joy and to be in awe and wonder. And although we would like to choose our emotions a la carte, and bypass, as Jamie says, and get to that, just as a reminder to us that it's not going to be like we're going to be in pain and then we're going to have a joyful life. Life is about the movement, the dance between allowing ourselves to sit in the suck and be in the pain, and savor the little moments of delight, the hug from the grandfather, the beautiful sky, the rainbow, to sort of be with both. That's our invitation.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Quinn. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Myra. And thank you, Kyle. And thanks to all of you who are gathered here tonight. Your contributions in the chat were so helpful and so amazing. Thank you for being present with us. Once again, thanks to those of you who made a donation for this program. You can still support Reimagine's efforts to provide free, accessible, and engaging events for folks facing the hardest parts of life. Nicole, please paste that survey in the chat. This is really important. We want your feedback. We want to know how we're doing here. So if you could take some time to start filling that out now, and then we'll leave and you continue doing it, that would be wonderful. We want to know what can be improved. We want to know what your interests are. Again, please join us for the remaining 2 events in this series, The Long Goodbye. We've got one on Wednesday next week, and the following Wednesday. Nicole's pasting those in the chat as well. And that's it. Thanks to all of you, and I hope to see you all next Wednesday. Have a beautiful, restful evening.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. It's been an honor to be with you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.